What happens when you take inspiration from a flower but decide deliberately not to copy it? I'm going to take the dramatic shape and the colors of the Strelitzia flower, or bird of paradise, if you like to call it that way, and I'm going to turn them into a piece of wearable art using polymer clay, of course. And it feels a little bit like cheating, because when you are working with such a sculptural, such a dramatic, and such a colorful inspiration, you cannot not end up with a beautiful, dramatic, sculptural, colorful piece of jewelry. And it feels like cheating also because the Strelitzia flower will hand us on a platter the color scheme, the color combo for this piece, and I'm going to sprinkle in some of my design decisions and my thought process behind it. And we are going to beautifully finish this piece with a faux ceramic effect. So let's dive in. I want to talk briefly about my inspiration. I personally love the Strelitzia flower, and this is because it reminds me of some beautiful places I've visited, like Madeira and Nice in the south of France. And I love this flower because it has such a strong visual language. It has dramatic petals and it has directional lines. And I personally like the combination of yellow, orange, blue, and green. So I'll start by making an element that looks something like a green pot. And in order to make this element, I'm going to mix 1 unit of Fimo Professional True Yellow polymer clay with 1 unit of Fimo Professional True Blue. I'm going to use a round cutter to make sure that I'm using the same amount of each color, and of course these polymer clay sheets were conditioned previously, and I passed them through the same setting of the pasta machine, so you can consider that I'm mixing a 1-to-1 ratio. And I am going to mix the colors together, and I'm going to blend them until I get a very beautiful yellowish green. But of course you can decide to stop when marbling the clay and make an interesting pot that is going to be more painterly or graphic if you use the marbled clay instead of solid yellow greenish yellowish green color. But this is a design choice you'll have to make. And I think this solid green is going to support the focal point, which are the colorful petals. And I think this type of green is not competing for attention with the bright colored petals. And I like this balance between the focal and non-dominant element. And if you like this design side of jewelry making and you want to uncover your own signature style for jewelry design, I invite you to join the waitlist for my program From Clay to Signature Style on learnpolymerclay.com. And then I'm going to roll everything into a ball, and then I'm going to start elongated this element, and I'm going to roll the ends against my working table, and then I'm going to work a little bit on the middle part of the pot. And of course you will notice something important. In fact, this is actually not the shape of the base of a real Strelitzia flower, and that was intentional because I wanted this part of the neck piece to feel a little bit more sculptural and more interesting. I wanted to spark interest and to create curiosity. I'm working on the ends of the pod and I'm making them slightly pointed, and I'm using my fingers to give the whole a curved shape. And I'm even going to use one pointy end of the pod and curl it slightly backwards because I want to give more interest to this pod, and I thought this is going to add more movement to the finished piece. The eye will travel from the petals to the pod and the shape of the pod, and then to the flower, to the petals of the second flower and the second pod. And I also think that the curvature of the design helps the eye travel like that. Before jumping to making the petals, you'll have to consider how you are going to attach the elements to make a jewelry piece. So I decided to use some gold color eye pins that I'm going to trim a little bit using flash cutters and then use flat nose pliers to make a king on the other end. And this is how I'm going to securely attach the floral element to the rest of the design. And I'm going to use my craft knife, make an indentation on one side of the pod, and then gently press the eye pin with the king inside the clay, and the king will secure the eye pin inside the polymer clay, which is a very important, let's say, engineering um, tip for this design. And then I'm going to use a needle tool and make sure that the area around the eye pin looks professional, and you don't have an indentation anymore. Everything is closed. You'll notice that I'm wearing gloves, and I'm wearing gloves because we are going to touch the clay a lot while making this design. And of course, I don't want to leave fingerprints on top of the clay. So wearing gloves is always a good idea. And now it's time to make the most beautiful part of the neck piece, which are the petals. And these are, in the same time, the recognizable part of the Strelitzia flower. And I decided to use two sizes of petal cutters, and I'm going to use two sizes for variation, and I'm using petals for repetition. And so I cut in total 6 petals with a larger cutter and 6 petals with smaller cutter. And in fact, I'm going to use 3 larger petals and 3 smaller petals to create like fan shapes for the flower, for each flower. And when cutting the flowers with the cutter, I'm going to gently smooth off the edges. I'm going to work a little bit on the shapes because I don't want to have cut out cookie cutter shapes for my design. I'm going to make them slightly pointy, slightly elongated. And so after smoothing the edges, so I won't need to sand the pieces after. Ideally, I don't need to sand the pieces after baking them and after working a little bit on the shape. I'm going to use again the smaller cutter, and this time I'm going to use it with Fimo Professional True Blue Polymer Clay. And this time I'm going to cut out 4 smaller petals, but these are not just going to be just petals. I'm going to cut them, trim them a little bit more, and turn them into little and turn them into little arrow-shaped elements. And for this, I'm cutting into the upper part on both sides, and I'm removing part of the clay in the center and the bottom. And in fact, you will end up with something that looks like an arrowhead or a clock hand. And this is the and this is my favorite part of the design because it these element these elements bring in more contrast, and I personally like contrast in my pieces. And it they also introduce a visual line inside the flower, like a central point inside the focal point, the focal element. And let's say this creates a tension point right inside the focal point of the piece. And now you understand why I said that I'm taking the idea of a Strelitzia flower, but I'm going to work on it and alter it and turn it into my own vision of a Strelitzia flower. Now the part that we all love, which is coloring the elements, and as you can see, I'm using yellow polymer clay for the petals, and this is my main color in the finished design. But I'm using yellow polymer clay because this represents joy for me, and this is the feeling that I want to express in this neck piece. And this is a feeling that I like to express in my jewelry pieces in general. So I'm going to use some soft pastels, and I'm just using the blade to scrape some light orange, darker orange, and a little bit of fuchsia colored soft pastels. And in fact, I'm using the orange tones to add a little bit warmth to the petals and more definition, but you'll notice that I'm not covering the entire surface of the petal, and this is because I want to have the original yellow clay visible for two reasons. I want to have the yellow visible for variation, but also for attaching the clay pieces concerns. So for the variation, I think that when you color only parts of the petal, you will end up with petals that have more depth and a 3D look. But if you color the entire area, you will end up with flat blocks of color. So a design principle that I keep in mind when working, color doesn't have to cover all the piece, and you don't have to color all the piece like a 5-year-old with a box of colored pencil. And sometimes a little bit of color in the right place has much more visual impact. You'll notice that I'm adding a little bit of magenta, or a little bit of fuchsia pastel around the edges, and while it's a very small amount, it does give the yellow orange petal a more impact, and it makes the petals pop even more. And of course, I'm going to do the same for all the petals, the smaller one, the larger ones. I'm also being careful not to put pastel on the underside of the petals, because we are going to place these elements one on top of the other, the petals and the arrow shaped element, and then the petal, and stack the eye pin in between. And if you apply pastel in those areas, you won't get a secure connection between the layers of clay, so keep this in mind. For the blue arrow-shaped petals, I'm going to use some purple pastel and I'm going to color the pointed ends. And I feel that the purple creates a transition and adds a little bit more depth to this element, which grabs the attention when looking at the flower. And now you'll notice that we have something interesting happening. We have yellow orange as the dominant color. We have green as the supporting color. We have blue and the little purple on the end as an unexpected accent. Now we have all our components, and this is where the piece really starts to become jewelry. And now we need to connect the pieces, and in order to connect the petals to the pod, I intend to use the same attaching system, meaning that I'm going to use eye pins that I'm going to trim a little bit, and then use flat nose pliers to make a kink that will stay inside the clay that will grab the polymer clay. So again, I used my craft knife. I've made an opening inside the clay, and in fact, I'm going to make two openings in the middle area of the pod, and I'm going to attach three larger petals to one of the eye pins and three petals to the other one. But in order to make this connection even more secure, I decided to use a little bit of yellow clay and wrap the eye pin with yellow clay. And then I'm going to sandwich all the elements together. So I'm going to put two large petals and then the arrow petal, and then I'm going to put the eye pin wrapped with yellow clay and put the third yellow petal on top. And of course, I'm going to take the time and press all and gently press all the elements together and make sure that I have a very good connection. And for the second eye pin, I'm going to use the smaller orange yellow petals with the arrow petal in between. And in fact, I'm very careful to leave some space in between the the two fan elements, and this negative space will add even more interest to the design. And initially, I wanted to put some half moon elements on the other side of the petals, and I just used a round cutter and I cut the element in half. But then on a second thought, I felt that this kind of made the design heavier, and I decided to take them off. So I just put them next to the piece. I did not press them into the clay, so I could easily take them off. And I decided to add a little bit more visual weight to the flower that is sitting in the bottom part of the neck piece. And I'm going to use a tiny cutter and I'm going to cut two tiny round elements. And I'm going to color them with a little bit of fuchsia pastel to make them a little bit more visible on the final design. And I'm going to use a dotting tool to gently press them into the clay. And I feel that these two tiny elements add a little bit of visual weight to the final design, but at the same time add an element of asymmetry. Now it's time to bake the pieces, but not before you check if you are happy with the look of the pieces, if you have nothing to tweak that you you'll have to check if you smooth off the edges, especially if you don't want to sand the pieces after baking them. And then I'm going to bake them for 50 minutes at the temperature recommended by the polymer clay manufacturer on a tile wrapped in parchment paper, and I like to put some aluminum foil on top to protect the design, to protect the clay pieces from direct heat. Once the pieces have cooled down, we're ready for the finishing step of the process. And because I've applied soft pastel before baking, much of the color is going to be integrated into the polymer clay during the baking. So I don't necessarily need varnish to seal the pastel, but if I wanted luster, a shinier Faux ceramic effect, I could have used some glossy varnish to do so. After baking the pieces, I decided to bring in some acrylic paints to add more interest to some areas of the green pots, and I'm going to use some red acrylic paint to color the bottom part of the green pot because I felt it lacked definition. And after painting the bottom part of the pot with red acrylic paint, I still felt that this part of the piece looked flat. So I decided to use some green, add some lines inside the previously colored area, and add more dimension to the green pot. And I surely like the piece as it looks now after these little tweaks. And of course, you'll have to let the acrylic paint dry before assembling the finished piece. Now it's time to bring in the faux ceramic effect, and I'm going to use a white marker and I'm going to draw round dots, tiny dots on top of the green pots. And I think that this trick is going to add the faux ceramic effect that I want for this neck piece. And in the same time, it is going to make this piece even more interesting. It is going to spice up a little bit the design. So you'll just have to use a white permanent marker, or you could use white acrylic paint and a thin brush and paint such dots, and instantly your jewelry pieces will have a beautiful faux ceramic effect. And this is one of those moments when jewelry making becomes a little bit of a problem solving, because I couldn't find jump rings that would fit the thin stainless steel chain that I wanted to use for the neck piece. And I decided to use some 24 gauge gold color wire instead. I wrapped the wire around the neck metal element, and then I've put the wire through the middle of the gold colored chain that I'm going to put in half so that it has a visual appealing line, but in the same time it does not make the design heavier. And then I'm going to continue wrapping the wire around the metal frame, and I'm going to use again a short length of the same wire, to 24 gauge wire, that I'm going to put through the two ends of the gold colored chain. And then I'm going to wrap the wire around the eye pin of the second flower, the one with the tiny, two tiny elements, the extra two tiny elements. And then I'm going to put the wire through the chain again. And I'm going to finish this design by using some wire and just wrapping the second flower directly onto the metal neck element um, on top of the dangling element, which is represented by the doubled metal chain and the lower flower. And I like how this design dangles a little bit when you are wearing this neck piece, and I like this flowy movement in the design as well. If you enjoyed this style of tutorial where I mixed in not only the polymer clay inspiration and the step-by-step process, but also design decisions and my design thinking process behind the piece, let me know in the comments. I'd like to know your opinion about it. And if you'd like to develop your own identity as a jewelry maker, I invite you to join the waitlist for my program From Clay to Signature Style on learnpolymerclay.com. And also, if you are available at the end of September, beginning of October, from 30 September to the 4th of October, I want to invite you to see my jewelry pieces on display at the Romanian Jewelry Week in Bucharest at the National Library in Bucharest. Until then, stay tuned for more inspiration for work with polymer clay. Thank you.